So probably by now you're already familiarized with GitHub and versioning system, but the catch is, before you import your project into Vercel, I would strongly recommend doing a npm run build, because you're going to create an optimized build into your local machine. And with that, you can also see if there would be any errors happening when the code would go to Vercel or to Netlify. As you can see, this component module was not found. I need to understand why module was not found. Because it already gave me the description over here, I would just need to copy this and search into my code. And then I would see like, well, it doesn't exist this path. Or I have two options. If I'm trying to use this, trying to understand why and the root of why this is not being ported, sometimes you can just look into your tsconfig and then you can see how you're defining the paths, which is pretty important. But in our case, it's just a component that I added for you guys to see this error. So I will delete this because I don't need, and now I will just rerun. So as you can see, if it runs perfectly, it will check the validations, it will check the TypeScript ESLint if you're using. And if you use also the sitemap and robots, it will generate for you. That's it. A very important thing is to keep your secrets secret. Any project are you working on, you definitely have to connect a database provider or a mail provider. With that, we always create environment variable files, which is this .env. And in the .env, we will keep all the secrets, API keys, passwords, anything related to the app itself. In this case, as you can see, I have the router API key, MailChimp, and here is an example. I have a public API key, just like for Google Analytics in this example. Whenever I call like MailChimp API key, I will just need to use process.env and then call the API. And with that, I will have the API key from MailChimp. It's very important to remember that MailChimp API key will just work on server-side files. And why this is important? Because it will keep your environment variables secure. If you create a Next public, the framework Next.js will automatically understand that that's okay to be public environment variable. So these will be visible by client side, but these won't be visible by client side. This won't actually even exist for client side. So it's very important to remember, if you have something that needs password or authentication, but that can be public, just like Google Analytics, you don't need to hide it. You just need to use the next public prefix and use the name of your identifier. So now let's understand about client-side rendering and server-side rendering. Client-side rendering means that your code will run and execute at the client side, while server-side rendering means the server will render and display to your user. Why that's so important is because if you have a server-side rendering, Google and all the engines will be able to rank your site easier. Why? Because everything is being generated at the server side and will be easily accessible for SEO features. So now let's understand what makes a component server side and client side. So to make a component client side, you need to use any React hooks. These would include use state, use effect, use context, and at the top of your file, you would also need to use client. That will tell Next.js that this is a client component. And with that, you are able now to call the methods or call APIs using the await fetch and render as a client-side page, just like in React. The difference is a server-side component, you will be able to call the method into the server-side component, which is not available into the client side. The client side, you will definitely need to have a use effect and call a fetch. But within the server-side rendering, you can just call from the API the method itself and it will render and work. So that's the main difference from the client side to the server side in terms of structure, and they will both render the same code. And if you're concerned about the performance of your website and you want to try to improve, the Next.js has incredible documentation of how you can improve the performance speed of your website. A very easy example is if you're using the normal HTML image tags, I would recommend removing that and start using the Next.js image component. As you can see over here, you just need to call next/image and it's done because it's already into the framework, so you don't need to even install. That's a very useful one. What I like about the dynamic import is that some components you don't need to render at the build time of the page, and that will reduce the chunk of the loading time of your website. So it's very nice to use the dynamic imports if you have components that they can be rendered later on, like a footer component or components that are down in the page. It would be very useful for a loading speed and also to improve the user experience.